continue our sermon series called What Child Is This?, which is the title of a great hymn that we know, Christmas hymn. And one of the things we're asking the question is, what's so special about Jesus? To the rest of the world, we see a baby in a manger. It's great, looks great on a Christmas card, but what's the big deal? What's so significant about this birth? What's so significant about this person that is revealed to us? And we're going to be unpacking it. Last week we talked about Jesus, the Word. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Pastor Jen talked about that last week. And we're continuing to look at the Gospel of Matthew here this morning. And one of the things to kind of help us understand a little bit about what Matthew's revealing, what John has revealed to us, is we need to understand another word called a paradox. I'm not talking about two doctors in a room. I'm talking about paradox, P-A-R-A-D-O-X. Does anybody, that's a fancy word, but the definition of the word is that a paradox is when two things seem to contradict each other, yet reveal a truth, or tell that are true. They seem to be contradictory, but are true. And one of the things I think we have to understand about paradox is that when we look at a paradox, it helps us to understand some truth. So to give you an example of a paradox, I've got a graphic art from M.C. Escher. You may be familiar with his artwork. He was a 20th century graphic artist. You may have also seen one of his other ones where they've got the stairs going up and down and around, and you've got people walking up and down and sideways into doors that lead nowhere, and it gives you this perspective of how, it plays with your mind, basically. And how can these two things that seem to be opposed to each other or contradictory to each other actually be held in tension? That's what a paradox is, holding two things in tension that seem to contradict themselves. And this graphic artist is actually well known for giving us these perspective paradoxes, these based perspective of paradox. And so one of the things that I think is a paradox for us when we talk about who Jesus is this paradox that Jesus was both human and divine. It seems to be contradictory, doesn't it? It seems to be that how can one be both human and divine? How can these two coexist? How can they be in tension with each other and yet be true at the same time? And it's Jesus is one of our paradoxes in the Bible. And what Matthew and what John and what the gospel writers are revealing to us is Jesus was not only flesh and blood and human, but Jesus was God, the Son of God. And as Matthew reveals to us, God with us. How can Jesus be both human and divine? And yet, I would say that is true. Because we tend to err on the side of which one? Which one do we better understand? We understand the human side. We understand what it's like to be human. We get that part, right? So it's hard for us to understand how one of us could be divine, how God could become flesh. And so that's part of that. But that's what Matthew is pointing us to. Matthew actually reveals two things about Jesus' identity. First of all, the name Jesus. The name Jesus means Yahweh is our salvation, or God saves. So one of the things that Matthew is revealing to us in this name is that God saves, that God is our salvation. We're going to unpack that a little bit in a couple more weeks. We'll talk about Jesus, our Savior. But he also uses another name. And the other name he uses is actually out of a scripture passage from Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah. And several hundred years before Matthew, the prophet Isaiah had made this prophecy to King Ahaz. Now, King Ahaz was the king of the southern kingdom. At this point in time, Israel was divided into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. And we've got a map there. And the southern kingdom is in purple. You see the purple area? Obviously, Ahaz was a Ravens fan. And so in the green part to the north, that was the northern kingdom. Let's just pretend that's Green Bay. And Green Bay's coming. And so what was happening, there were two kings in the northern kingdom. And those two kings were threatening to attack Jerusalem, where King Ahaz was. And they were threatening to come down there and take over the southern kingdom. These two kings were unified, coming together to take over. And so Isaiah comes to Ahaz, and Ahaz is fearful. He's dreading this. He doesn't want this to happen, obviously. This is a threat. He's despondent. And Isaiah the prophet comes to him and says, look, Ahaz, God's going to be with you. And he says, this is going to be your sign. You need a sign. God's going to give you a sign. And that sign's going to be this in verse 14 of Isaiah 7. Look, the young woman is with child and shall bear a son and shall name him Emmanuel. And Matthew gives us a clue as to what Emmanuel means. It means God with us. God with us. That's what Matthew's revealing to us. Now, Jesus didn't get named Emmanuel, but his parents didn't name him Emmanuel. But what Matthew is saying is that Isaiah reveals to us, and Matthew is revealing to us, that this is God with us in this child. God with us. And that's what's so important about what Matthew is saying. And what Isaiah had said Ahaz was not only true for Ahaz, but it was true for those at the time of Jesus' birth. How important is it to know that God is with us? Especially when things are difficult. Especially when we're fearful like King Ahaz, or when we're going through dark times, or we're feeling threatened in some way. How important is it for us to know this truth that God is with us? It's pretty important. Pretty encouraging, actually. That to know that God is with us, that God has not abandoned us. Because I don't know about you, but when difficult things happen or bad things happen, or I'm having a particularly bad season of life or something like that, the instant interpretation of those bad circumstances is that God is not with us. Have you ever noticed that? Have you ever noticed that when bad things happen, we interpret that as God not being with us? When in reality, God could very well be with us. Because we all experience those difficulties in life and those bad things that happen to us. Now, some of those bad things that happen to us, we've created. Some of those difficulties we've created. We've brought on ourselves by our own behavior, decisions, lack of wisdom, whatever, our own sin, and we sometimes create our own darkness. And there are times, though, when we're in darkness, we're in this difficult place, and we're not responsible for it. And it's important to know that God is with us, because we often interpret it the other way. We often interpret it as God not being there. Where are you, God? Why have you abandoned us? St. John of the Cross, I know you guys read him every week in your spare time. St. John of the Cross was a monk in the 16th century, and he wrote a lot about the spiritual growth process. And he's famous for this one idea of the spiritual growth process, and one of the ideas he talks about is what's called the dark night of the soul. That people in their spiritual growth go through these seasons of darkness, or these seasons where this dark night of the soul is that moment where you feel like God is just nowhere to be found, as though God has abandoned you. And that this is a normal part of the spiritual growth process, is what St. John would say, that we all go through these dark nights. We all go through these moments where we feel completely abandoned by God. Even Jesus went through that on the cross. This complete abandonment where he says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? But what St. John says is that this is part of God's maturing us, growing us up spiritually. To give you a kind of better understanding, I can tell you about a dark night that my daughter had when she was a toddler, maybe younger. It was that season where she had learned to not have to depend on nursing anymore, and she was moving on to the cereal part. You remember that, those of you who've had young children? So she's starting to grow up, and she's starting to do that, but she was used to getting up in the middle of the night, 2 a.m. in the morning, 3 a.m. in the morning, 4 a.m. in the morning, and she wanted something to eat, or she wanted attention, or she just wanted to see mom and dad. And mom and dad wanted to sleep. And so we went through this process, this technique that we all know. It's called let them cry it out. Let them stay in their crib and let them cry, and they'll figure it out. But I want you to think about it from my daughter. This is my oldest daughter. They both went through it, but the oldest daughter, Rachel, think about it from her perspective for a minute. Think about that moment when she was crying and mom and dad didn't show up. What did she think? Oh. She had her own little dark night experience, didn't she? She thought, where's mom and dad? And mom and dad are sitting in the other room. Were we abandoning her? No. We were there. We just weren't coming right away to her every cry. And I imagine that at that moment in her life, and that's the hard part for the parent, is they're like, how can you let your kid do that? That's the parent stuff that starts going inside of you. But we knew that if we didn't allow that to happen, she wouldn't learn to grow up. She wouldn't learn how to figure out how to go to sleep without mom and dad. It's part of the process, you see. So she went through this mini dark night of her own so that she could grow. And that's what St. John is saying, is that you and I spiritually, in a much deeper way, go through these dark nights of our own where we feel like God's not there, but God is there. God's right there with us, allowing us to go through that season so that we might learn, grow, mature, become stronger in our faith, and also know that God, but the thing is that God has not abandoned us. God is still with us. I mean, that's what the whole nation of Israel had been going through before Emmanuel showed up. Several hundred years gone by, they had been hoping, waiting for a sign, waiting for Emmanuel, waiting for the Messiah. And how many generations went by waiting and wanting and hoping, and God not revealing? How many times? I mean, how long do we wait? Or are we willing to wait? Are we willing to wait a generation? I don't know about you, but I want God to show up in 30 minutes. If you're not there in 30 minutes, I'm going to turn attention to something else. But there was a matter of faithfulness even in the darkness that they were going through. Mary and Joseph, was it easy for them? They literally had God with them, but that didn't change their circumstances. Didn't change the fact that Joseph had lost his reputation as a righteous man in his community. It didn't change the difficulty that Mary had to face of explaining this birth. It didn't change the fact that Herod sent soldiers into Bethlehem to get rid of all the young children in Bethlehem, seeking to destroy and get rid of Jesus, the Messiah. That was a dark time. The Roman government was in charge. Israel was an independent nation. But things were so bad, Mary and Joseph had to run away to Egypt for a season. Their plans changed. But was God not with them? No. God was clearly with them. God was right there all the way. Paul reminds us of this. If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not withhold his own son, but gave him up for all of us, will he not with him also give us everything else? God is for us, not against us, Paul says. God is with us. What do you do, though, when you're in the darkness? What do you do when you're in that place of darkness? I think a great story that kind of helps us understand what to do in the darkness is a story I've told before a couple years ago about a father and a son who were living in Armenia. The year was 1989, and the father one day went off, his son went to school, the father went off to work, and during that day there was a severe earthquake in Armenia in 1989. Word got to the father at his place of work that the school that his son was attending had been destroyed in the earthquake, had crumbled in on itself during the earthquake. And so the father immediately went to the school where the devastation had happened. All the parents were starting to gather around and weep for their children. Some of them were in shock. Some of them wondered whether they were still alive or not. Others had given up and resigned themselves to thinking their children were gone. This particular father decided he was going to dig no matter what. That he started to just jump in and start pull the rubble away, pull the stones away. He was going to start digging. He knew he had an idea of what section of the building his son's classroom was in, and so he began to dig for that area. Some of the parents tried to stop him, saying, "It's no use, it's no good, you can't do this." He said, "I'm going to dig anyway." So he dug. A couple other parents joined him. And he dug for 12 hours, and then 24 hours, and then 36 hours. And at hour 38, he moved some of the rubble, and he revealed a dark space underneath all the rubble. And he thought he heard some movement. And so he called into the darkness, and he said, "Is anybody in there?" And that's when he heard the voice of his son. And there were some others in there with his son. And his son said to them, "I told you he'd come for us. I told you he'd come for us." So what was that little boy doing in the darkness? What was he doing? One thing he was doing was he was saying, I know my dad. I know who my dad is. I know the character of my dad. Why? Because he had a personal relationship with his father. And that personal relationship helped him to know the character of his dad and how much his dad loved him and how much his dad would not give up on him. He knew that about his dad's character. He knew that's the type of man his father was because he had a relationship with his dad. The other thing he was doing was he was trusting that his dad was coming, right? He trusted. That's faith. Faith is simply trust. He knew that his dad was going to come for him. He had faith that that was going to happen. But here's the other thing he was doing in the darkness. What was he telling the other children? I know my dad. And my dad's going to find us. That's who my dad is. And he's coming for us. The thing about this is even if they don't survive, it doesn't change who his dad is, does it? His dad still would have dug. Dad still would have gone through the rubble because that's who his dad was. It's the same with God. God's character does not change. God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Whether we are going through difficulty or not, God doesn't change. God's character doesn't change. The fact that God is with us does not change. What the difference is whether or not we recognize it, right? Our awareness of it, our trust in it, our faith in it. Is God with us? Yes. Do we trust that? Hopefully. So as we go through this Advent season, it's often easy to focus on the darkness, isn't it? I mean, I can imagine being in that dark place. And it would have been so easy just to focus on the darkness that the children were in. But what Matthew is saying and what Isaiah is saying is, look for a sign. Look for some evidence that God is with you. So I'd ask you to reflect on that this day and this week. If you're finding yourself in a difficult place or a dark place, look for a sign. Look for Emmanuel, God with us. Amen.